Something you should probably know about me is that I hate country music. Now, I appreciate how deeply offensive that might be to some of you, because for some of you watching this, you love nothing more than just sticking on the latest Garth Brooks tune with the windows down on your way to a social or a ceilidh. That's totally your thing. And you know, in a very real sense, I'm totally fine that you may like that. Your love of country music is fine, it doesn't really bother me. Your love of ceilidhs or socials also doesn't bother me. If that's what you're into, that's totally fine. However, truth be told, it's just not for me. It might be your thing, but it's really just not my thing. Do you know, I wonder, is it possible that you view church in the same way that I view country music and socials and ceilidhs? You're not really a fan. It's definitely not something that you're interested in. You're well aware that other Christians love it, and that's totally fine. If that's their thing, then that's totally fine. But it's just not my thing. It might be for them, that's okay, but it's just not for me. Do you ever feel that way about the church? Well, unfortunately, as a Christian, the Bible just doesn't allow us to give the church that low a priority. You might respond by saying, well, sure, but the vast majority of the Bible doesn't even mention the church. It's only really the book of Acts where we first see the church even mentioned, so how can it be that important? And while it may be true that the church is not explicitly mentioned until the New Testament, it's important that we see, as we look through the whole Old Testament scriptures, the church was always a highly anticipated thing and was always a very important part of God's great purposes for our world. You might recall, as we've seen throughout this course, that God made a number of covenants or promises with his people throughout the Old Testament. And perhaps the most significant covenant in the Old Testament was the one that God made with Moses and the people of Israel. Do you remember it? God vowed that the people of Israel would be his chosen people, his chosen nation. They would receive his favour and blessing. They were to enter into relationship with God. And in turn, what did they have to do? Well, they had to live a life of obedience to God. And through all of this special relationship between God and Israel, the other nations of the world, that is the Gentile nations, the ones that weren't Jewish, well, they would see God's relationship with Israel. They would see what life lived under God's rule is like, one with obedience and blessing in return. And so they too, in response to that, seeing that, would also come to worship this great God. But what happens as you read through the Old Testament? We've already seen it so many times. How did God's people, the Israelites, do in keeping their end of the covenant, their end of the bargain? Well, we've seen it so many times already. They fail time and time again. They let God down time and time again. And some of these people who let God down in terrible ways actually loved God. They were people who were genuinely authentic in trying to follow God and develop their relationship with him. People like Abraham and Moses and David, they loved God and were very earnest in their desire to follow him, but were still just so weighed down by their sin. Of course, there are many others who had no time for God, who were technically a part of Israel. They actually willfully violated God's law. They didn't really care. Yet because they were born into Israel as descendants of Abraham, they were still technically considered one of God's people. They're still kind of a part of the covenant community. And so in the Old Testament, God's people were kind of this mixed bag, weren't they? Some of them were authentic followers. They were very earnest in their desire to follow God, people like David and Moses. And we're going to see those people in heaven, the new heavens and the new earth. But there were others who were technically part of the covenant community. They were born into Israel, but they didn't really care. They weren't authentic. And so all this considered, as you look at the Old Testament people of God, the people of Israel, they failed badly in their task of being a light to the Gentiles. But you know, the Old Testament prophets, time and time again, anticipated a day where there would be this new covenant. God would have a new type of relationship with his people. One such example in the Old Testament where we read of this new covenant being looked forward to is in Jeremiah chapter 31. This covenant, Jeremiah says, will not be like the old covenant that God made with Israel, verse 32. And what's different about this coming new covenant? Well, verse 33 says, in this covenant God will write his law on everyone's hearts. He really will be their God, and they really will be his people. This covenant, verse 34, won't be a mixed covenant like the old covenant with Israel, where some of the people in the covenant community were true followers and some weren't. No, actually in this new covenant, to actually be a part of the covenant community, you must truly be one of God's children. You see, what's Jeremiah pointing us forward to? He's pointing us forward to the new covenant church of Jesus Christ. He's pointing forward to the new covenant that you and I now live under. To be one of God's children now, you don't just have to be ethnically Jewish. That doesn't really make a difference. To be one of God's children now and to be a part of his covenant, what must happen? You, regardless of who you are and where you're from, must put your faith in Jesus Christ. And how's all this going to happen? Well, other Old Testament prophecies help us piece things together, don't they? For example, you've got the prophet Joel in the Old Testament, and he, in chapter 2, verse 28 of his book, says that in the last days, that's a reference to the time when the new covenant is set in motion, the days we're already in the last days, God is going to pour out his Spirit on all flesh. Now, reading that in the Old Testament is interesting, isn't it? Because in the Old Testament, God didn't pour out his Spirit on all flesh. God's Spirit came upon people at particular times, in particular ways, for particular purposes. But God's Spirit in the Old Testament didn't indwell in people. But these Old Testament prophecies pointed forward to a day when God's Spirit would indwell people. And when would that time come? Well, we read about that exact day arriving at the start of the book of Acts.